Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. As days and nights fly past. January 1st, 2010. Try to get the body in a comfortable position. Try to keep your back straight. But not ramrod straight. Comfortably straight. Face forward. Close your eyes. Put your hands in your lap, your right hand on top of your left. And there you are. The next step is to put the mind in a comfortable position, and that takes more time. First, start with thoughts that are comfortable to think. May I be happy, may all living beings be happy, as in the chant we chanted just now. That's a comfortable thought to think. And think about the possibility of a true happiness. A happiness that doesn't harm you, doesn't harm anybody else. Because it comes from within. Those are good thoughts to think as well. True happiness is possible, and it doesn't have to harm anyone, unlike most of the pleasures of the world, where if someone gains something, somebody else has to lose. And not just lose. Some people actually are harmed by other people's search for happiness. But here's a search for happiness where nobody gets harmed. Where do you find that happiness? You find it within. So the next step is to focus on your breath, because the breath is a good anchor for keeping the mind in the present. It's also what makes the present livable in terms of getting the mind to settle comfortably into the body in the present moment. The breath is the part of the body that's most changeable and lies most under your control. It can have an effect on whether you're going to be sitting here in pain or sitting here in pleasure. Take a couple of good long deep in and out breaths. See how that feels. If it feels good, keep it up. If not, you can change to shorter breathing or longer breathing. Heavier or lighter, deeper or more shallow, faster or slower, broader or more focused. There are lots of different ways you can breathe. Experiment to see what the range of breathing can do for the body. It's like getting a new stereo. You fiddle with the dials to see how they affect the sound, what kind of noises you can get out of your stereo. Then you finally decide on the settings you prefer. And you can do the same with the breath. Nobody's here to tell you that one way of breathing has to be better than another. You get to choose. And in choosing, you develop your own powers of discernment. As you begin to see that some ways of breathing feel good for a while, but after a while they don't feel so good, well, you get to change. You try other ways. You also notice how you think about the breath. What kind of concept do you use to picture the breathing process to yourself? When you breathe in, what's actually happening? You know there's air coming in and out of the lungs, but as you begin to get more sensitive to how you experience the process, you begin to see there's also a sense of energy that flows through the body. And that has a huge impact on how you're going to be sitting here for the rest of the hour. If the energy is allowed to flow smoothly and freely, you're more likely to be here with a sense of comfort. In fact, when the Buddha talks about the mind settling in, it's to develop pleasure and rapture. It's right here, in the way the breath energy flows, that the pleasure and the rapture are going to appear. So you work with that. Once you find a sense of ease, what can you do to maintain that ease? You can't clamp down on it. But you can't take a cavalier attitude toward it, either. It's something you want to protect. You have to be very observant as to how you're experiencing the body in the present moment, and to what ways you can experiment with that experience. Notice which ways of breathing create a sense of ease, which ways of breathing destroy that sense of ease, which ways of breathing, which ways of focusing on the breath energy help to maintain a sense of ease and allow it to grow to a sense of fullness, so that you feel full, all the way through the in-breath and all the way through the out. Don't try to squeeze the energy out as you breathe out. because that prevents the sense of fullness and rapture from arising. So, this allows us to sit here, the body comfortably in position, the mind comfortably in position. And that in and of itself can be healing. Healing to the body, healing to the mind. Learn how to maintain that. But it's more than just healing. As we all know, there's another side to the meditation, which is gaining insight. Maintaining this sense of comfort is actually what makes the insight possible. Why is that? Because a lot of the issues that we're going to try to gain insight into are not very comfortable to think about. Normally we approach them with a sense of desperation, fear, and anxiety, and so we can't really see them for what they are. Like that chant we had just now. Aging, illness, death, separation. These are things we don't like to think about. Most people take an ostrich attitude toward them. That if you bury your head in the sand, they won't see you and they'll go away. But that obviously doesn't work. The body grows old, even as you're sitting there. It grows sick. All those germs come floating to you through the air. And, of course, the body's going to die someday. This is something we all know. Death is one of the things that's totally certain, and yet most of us act as if it's not going to happen because we don't know how to think about it. We can't approach it with a sense of comfort, so we try to avoid it. But what the Buddha's having us do as we meditate is to develop a sense of comfort in body and mind, so that you can look at these things from a balanced and unthreatened perspective. Even though they're inevitable and potentially very painful, you don't have to suffer from them. That's an important point. For most of us, just the idea of aging, illness, and death causes us to suffer. Even more so, the actuality. As you grow old, you find there are things you can't do anymore. Your body simply won't let you. When you're sick, you're even more debilitated. And when you die, the body doesn't come and say, "I'm going to die on such and such a date. Get everything ready in time. Is this a convenient time to go? If not, we can negotiate." It doesn't discuss that at all. If it's going to go, it's going to go. The question is, how do you learn not to suffer from those things? And the answer is that you develop qualities of mind, and you also develop a certain attitude toward life. This is crucial. You need to gain a sense of what's really important in this limited span of time that we have when the body's still healthy, still relatively young, still functioning at least to some extent and still alive. What's really worth doing in this life? There's a question the Buddha has the monks reflect on every day, and it's not just for monks. It's for everybody who practices. It's, what am I becoming as days and nights fly past? This is a question he has you ask yourself every day. What am I becoming as days and nights fly past? It's an interesting question. We all know about the teachings on not self and going beyond becoming, but here the Buddha's asking you to reflect on yourself and what yourself is becoming. This is because there are areas in the practice where it is useful to develop a healthy sense of self, a skillful sense of self. This reflection is meant to develop that skillful sense of self through heedfulness, because all skillful qualities in mind come from being heedful. For a lot of people, as days and nights fly past, all they can think about is, how can I cram in as many pleasures and memories as possible? I want to make sure I'm not missing out on anything. Of course, when you do one thing, you're missing out on something else. Like packing a suitcase. The more you cram in, the more other things are going to spill out. If you take the attitude that the value of life lies in having lots of memories, well, we all know what the process of memory is like. We stash away certain ideas, and as they get brought up from the mind to reflect on, each time you put them back in the mind they get changed. After a while your memories get distorted and deformed. So what's left? A lot of lies the mind is telling itself about the past. They may look like gold, but they're fake. Years back, in 1997, I went to Alaska, and then I went back again in 2005. And even allowing for the fact that things do change, still I found that many of my memories from 1997 were impossible. Things I'd remembered from my first trip just couldn't have been that way, in terms of sights I had seen, places I had noticed, details that had struck me before. I went back and realized they couldn't have happened. And so you begin to wonder about devoting your life to gathering up memories. After a while, the memories are totally worthless. So the Buddha doesn't have you reflect on, what am I gathering up as days and nights fly past? But, what am I becoming? What kind of person are you becoming? What qualities of mind are you developing? Are you developing laziness? Are you developing complacency? Or are you developing heedfulness? Are you developing mindfulness? Because as the Buddha said, the things we tend to think about form an inclination for the mind, or as we would say, ruts for the mind. Ways in which you tend to act, ways in which you tend to think, that as you keep repeating them become harder and harder to leave. Each time you go over the same pattern, you're creating a deeper and deeper rut in the mind. Do you like the ruts you've been creating for yourself? Do you like the way you tend to act? This is important. They talk about people who lose their memory as they get older, but many of their personality traits are still there. If you've been developing kindness, compassion, and mindfulness, then even when your memories are gone, you'll still have something valuable. But if you've been developing your irritability, if you've been developing anger or selfishness, then those are the qualities you'll be left with. Do they have any value? Are they worth packing up and taking with you as you move on? In Thailand, I knew a number of meditators who had gone through brain damage, either through an accident or through surgery. One of them, one of Ajahn Fuang's students, had been through an operation on his heart. Apparently the doctors had clamped off the wrong arteries during the operation, and when he came out of the operation, he realized that his brain wasn't functioning the way it had been before. But he'd been developing the mindfulness and alertness through his meditation that enabled him to handle the slow recovery with a lot more skill and grace than most people would. So are you developing the mental skills you're going to need as the body begins to malfunction? Or are you developing mental attitudes and habits that will make things worse? This is important to reflect on. It gives you a handle on how best to approach aging, illness, and death. There are things you can do in preparation. One of the reasons most people don't like to think about these things is because they feel there's nothing they can do to prepare. When illness comes, we have to give the body over to the doctors. The doctors will take care of the problem sometimes. As for death, well, death just happens. You can't really do anything about it. You can't prepare, so you might as well not think about it. That's what many people think, but it's not the case at all. You can prepare. There's a skillful way to die, and there are many, many unskillful ways to die. They all depend on the mental qualities you've developed and what you've been becoming. This is one aspect of the practice where it's useful to think in terms of who you are, what you're becoming. It's a skillful use of the sense of self. It's not the case that every time you have a sense of self it's going to cause you to suffer. Some ways of thinking about yourself are actually part of the path. Toward the end of the path, you won't be needing them anymore. But when you're choosing what to do, you need a strong sense of what's worth doing and what's not, what you'll be benefiting from down the line, what you'll be suffering from down the line, depending on what you're doing right now. The heedful sense of self is well worth protecting because it keeps your actions in line, gives you a sense of priorities. It encourages you to stay on the skillful path. These distinctions are important. It's not the case that non-duality is where we're headed or what we want to develop along the path. We need to see distinctions, especially between what's skillful and what's not, because we're making choices and they have their impact. We can't simply go on the idea that, well, my motivation is compassionate, therefore everything I do out of my compassionate motivation is going to be skillful. That doesn't work at all. You have to educate your compassion. There are times when something seems to be compassionate right now, but as you begin to look down the line, you realize it's not the right or wise or even kind thing to do. This requires that you be careful, that you notice what's happening. And if, as days and nights fly past, you begin to detect signs of complacency, you can do something about it. If you begin to see signs of mindlessness, try to develop mindfulness instead. You've got to keep watch on these things. After all, with the passage of time, as we get older, we can develop more and more abilities for a while, but then there comes a point where the body begins to reverse direction. You lose abilities. You lose strength. For a while you can make a difference by exercising and looking after your diet, but they've done studies to show that there's a certain point, as you get older, that exercise doesn't make any difference anymore. The body's just going to decay, regardless. Some forms of exercise that used to strengthen the body actually become bad for it. So you have to be very careful, while at the same time realizing that your true wealth lies in the mind. Are you stashing wealth into the mind? Or are you squandering your mental wealth and replacing it with sand and broken feathers? Are you trading candy for gold? Or gold for candy? There's that story in the canon of a village that suddenly had to be evacuated, so the villagers fled, leaving many of their belongings behind. After a while, two men from a nearby village said, "Let's go check out this village and see what was left behind. Maybe there's something valuable." They went through the houses and found some flax plants that had been harvested and were being prepared to make linen. Because these flax plants had some value, the men tied them up in bundles and loaded them on their shoulders. But as they went on, they found linen thread. And one man said, "This is what we wanted the flax plants for anyhow, so let's throw away the flax plants and take up the linen thread instead." The second man said, "No, I wrapped up my flax plants really nicely. I don't want to let go of them." So the first man threw away his flax plants and took the linen thread, while the second one kept his flax plants. They went along a little further and they found linen cloth. The same thing happened. The first man threw away his linen thread to load up on the linen cloth, but the second one kept his nicely wrapped flax plants. After the linen cloth, they found things of greater and greater value, until they finally ran across copper, silver, and gold. So when they were finished, the second man returned from the village with nothing but the flax plants he wrapped up so nicely, whereas the first one came back with a whole load of gold. The wife of the second man was pretty upset. The wife of the first man was very happy because he knew what to throw away and knew what to keep. So you have to ask yourself, do you know what to throw away? Do you know what to keep? What are you gathering up? Are you gathering up just memories? Or are you gathering up skills? The skills are gold. The memories are flax plants. The gold is going to be helpful as the inevitable happens as the body grows ill, as it ages, as it begins to lose its functions and finally dies. The qualities of the mind you've been developing are going to be your gold. So what habits are you gathering up as days and nights fly past? That's what you're becoming as days and nights fly past. This is one of the reasons why we try to get the mind into a state of comfort and ease, so that we can think about these things clearly, helpfully, so that we'll recognize gold when we see it. And we'll know how to get the most out of it. The wisdom of wising up. February 15, 2011. When you meditate during a Dhamma talk, pay very little attention to the talk. Give your primary attention to the meditation, to what you're doing right now. Focusing on the breath. If you find the mind wandering off, bring it back. The talk helps you realize when you've wandered off. It acts like a fence. If you run up against the fence, you come back to the breath. It also helps point out things you might notice in the breath, ways you can deal with the breath to help the mind to settle down and feel secure and happy. This can take time, getting the mind and the breath to settle down together. During that period of settling down, the mind can get discouraged and bored. It can find all sorts of reasons for not staying in the present, which aborts the process. To settle the mind takes not only time, but also as few interruptions as possible. Ultimately, though, the mind can begin to notice that the act of focusing on the breath does give it a better place to stay. As results gradually build, the breath grows smoother. The energy in the body has fewer conflicts. It seems to flow in harmony, and it provides a good stable place to stay. The mind is able to settle down more quickly and securely. Giving the mind a good foundation allows it to really see clearly what it's doing, and to see where it's made mistakes. There's a lot to learn from mistakes, and yet most of us don't like looking at them. We pretend they didn't happen. If something in life goes badly, we tend to blame other factors, either other people or things totally beyond our control. There are times when problems do come from outside, but those aren't the ones that cause the most suffering, and they're not the ones you're responsible for. You're responsible for the areas where you can make choices. That's what you want to look for. The Buddha once said that one of the signs of wisdom is recognizing your own foolishness, seeing where you've made mistakes. That gives you an opportunity to change your ways. As he says, a fool who recognizes his own foolishness is to that extent wise. Even then, there are foolish and wise ways of looking at your own foolishness. To say, I am a fool closes off a lot of opportunities. If you're a fool, what are you going to do? There's not much room for self-improvement. Telling yourself, I've been a fool though, opens the possibility that you can change your ways. So, how do you recognize you've been a fool? You see the consequences of your actions. You did something and it caused harm, either to yourself or to other people, and yet you had a choice. You didn't have to choose to do that foolish action. Recognizing choices and recognizing the consequences of your choices teaches the important principle that the mind needs to be trained so it can make better choices. Always keep this in mind. It's the beginning of wisdom. What causes you to make wrong choices? 3 main things: faulty intentions, faulty perceptions, or paying attention to the wrong things. Ask yourself, what was my perception of this situation? Why or how was it wrong? What signals were coming my way that I didn't pay attention to? Sometimes you may have read the situation and signals very accurately, yet you still proceeded with what you wanted to do. That was your intention. That's the element of will. So you can investigate 3 main questions. What am I paying attention to? What is my perception? What is my intention? As meditators, we learn how to explore all 3 of these questions. First, we're taught to pay attention to where there's suffering and what's causing it. This can start on a blatant level in any area of life, and then move into the mind. While meditating, consider what ways of breathing and focusing on the breath are causing stress. As you're paying attention to the issue of stress, you can move to questions of perception, asking yourself how your perceptions are acting as a cause of stress, and how they might be converted to act as the path to its end. You might ask, is this stress caused by the way I perceive the breath? What kind of mental picture do I have of the breathing process? How does that add to the stress? Where does it create barriers in the body that prevent the breath energy from flowing in easily? If you perceive the body as a bellows with only a tiny hole where the breath can come in, how about changing the perception to one where all your pores are holes where the breath can come in and out, so you don't have to pull it in or push it out? Also, think of the breath permeating everywhere in the body, like water in a sponge. You can find other ways of perceiving, too. Try asking, when the breath comes in, what direction does it flow in the body? Does it flow up? If it's flowing up, is it causing headaches? If that's the case, let it flow down. There's a famous Zen monk of centuries past, Hakuin, who began suffering from what he called Zen sickness. Basically, it was excess energy going up into his head. His way of curing it was to think of a huge ball of butter on top of his head gradually melting. Each time he breathed in, the perception of melting butter allowed the breath energy to flow down. Those are questions of perception. Then there are questions of intention. As you're meditating, you're dealing very directly with intention. Are all the members of the committee on board with the desire to stay with the breath? Which ones aren't? When they're not on board, where do they want to wander? What are they looking for? Why? The Buddha said to try to get the mind to settle down in right concentration, you have to seclude it from unskillful qualities. You have to seclude it from sensuality. Sensuality means your obsession with thinking about and planning sensual pleasures. All too often, when the mind finds it has an opportunity of a whole hour with no other responsibilities, it wants to think about sights, sounds, smells, tactile sensations, and flavors. All kinds of things. planning tomorrow's meal or reflecting on today's meal. Remind yourself that doesn't really accomplish anything. The Buddha once said, if you find yourself obsessed with sensuality, you'd be better off sleeping. He never really encouraged sleep that much, but this is one case where sleep is the preferable alternative, better than obsessing over sensuality. Still better is getting the mind out of the sensual realm and into the realm of form, your sense of the body from the inside, which is what you're developing while you're working with the breath energy in the body. So, if you find the mind wandering off to sensual pleasures, remind yourself, this is not the time for that. If it's really obsessed, you can remind yourself of all the dangers that come from sensuality. There are many passages in the canon where the Buddha describes or gives examples and analogies to undercut the glamour and the allure that sensual pleasures have for us. They're like a drop of honey on the blade of a knife. They're like borrowed goods that the owners can take back at any time. Thinking about these analogies can help bring to your senses. He said you also have to seclude the mind from unskillful qualities. This covers everything from wrong views, wrong results, any of the path factors that are wrong, that involve thoughts of cruelty or ill will. Even when people behave unjustly, you have to learn how to set aside thoughts of revenge because they accomplish nothing good. Remind yourself that what other people do is their karma, what you do is your karma. You can't ultimately be responsible for their karma, however, you can be responsible for your own actions. So, you spread thoughts of goodwill. Thoughts that they may be happy, and especially that they may understand the causes for true happiness, and then really act on them. That's a thought you can extend even to people who are really cruel. In fact, you especially want to extend that to cruel people, so that instead of focusing on getting revenge or retribution, you open your mind to the question of what you might do or say that would actually get them to change their ways. That way your intentions become more skillful. Sometimes it's good to do preventive strikes on wrong results before you settle down. If you know that the mind has been obsessing about a particular thought during the day, you've got to do some antidote thinking to pry the mind loose. Other times, you may realize the problems only after you've started settling down with the breath. Something springs up unexpectedly from just below the surface. For instance, you may start thinking about things you did or said in the past that you really regret. In that case, spread thoughts of goodwill to whoever you harmed. Resolve not to repeat that mistake, and then get back to the breath, realizing that a mind well-centered, with a good solid foundation, is much more likely to be able to stick to its skillful intentions and results. In this way, as you meditate, you learn the lessons that help you wise up after realizing you've been foolish. Strengthen these lessons by looking at your intentions, attention, and perceptions, and realize that these govern your actions. Remember, what you do is what matters. There's a clear distinction between skillful and unskillful. You don't want to act in unskillful ways. You've seen the harm. This is the wisdom of wising up. Recognizing when you've been a fool in any way. The lessons implicit in that wisdom include believing that choices are real, they have real consequences, those choices depend on views, which in turn are based on perceptions, attention, and intentions, what you would like to achieve through your actions. These are all important lessons. This is why the Buddha focuses on these elements as being crucial to what shapes your life, so you can start shaping it in a wise way. When you consider the Buddha's teachings, for example, the Four Noble Truths, the 3 characteristics, the 5 hindrances, it's easy to dismiss them as cultural relics or somebody's personal proclivity. Why not 5 or 3 noble truths? Why does he focus on these particular teachings? Why focus on suffering? Was there something about his culture that kept him from seeing the beauty of life? Remember, though, that all of his teachings have their roots in some very common human experiences, in particular, the wisdom of wising up. It's about seeing when you've been a fool. It's not that you are a fool, but you've been foolish. Keep that distinction in mind and use it to take heed of the lessons you can learn from having been foolish. Make the most of any opportunities to overcome this past foolishness and to act wisely. That's when you get in touch with the root values that led the Buddha to teach the way he did and to focus on the things he focused on. You see how wise he really was. So take that wisdom of wising up and see how far it can go. Living forward, understanding backward. March 7, 2007. As a famous thinker once said, the basic problem in life is that we live forward but understand backward. In other words, we make decisions that are going to have an impact on the future, but we don't know the future, and often we don't know what that impact will be. All we know is what's happened in the past, and sometimes we don't even know that very well, because our memory gets fogged, distorted. Psychologists have observed that most people tend to repeat decisions they made in the past, even though the decisions didn't really make them happy. We forget, we thought it would make us happy the last time around, and it didn't. Well, we try it again and again. In other words, it's Einstein's definition of insanity. Doing the same thing but expecting different results. So it's a normal part of our lives that we're going to make mistakes, make decisions that we hope will lead to happiness, to good situations, and then they turn out leading to something else. If we don't want to be insane, we have to learn how to learn from our mistakes. The first step in doing that, though, is to prevent as many mistakes as possible. We do that by being as observant as possible. This is one of the reasons why we meditate. To get rid of as much delusion as we can, to try to be more mindful, more alert. Mindfulness is basically the ability to strengthen your memory, in this case, your active memory. If you want to do something, you keep reminding yourself to do it. You sense that it's going to be a good thing, that it will be in your interest, so you don't forget. Don't get distracted by other ideas or other intentions. As for alertness, that's what enables you to pay close attention to what you're actually doing. So while we're focused on the breath, we're developing mindfulness and alertness, and a quality called ardency, which means the desire that, whatever you do, you try to do skillfully. In this case, try to relate to the breath in a skillful way. Try to notice what in the past worked in getting the mind to settle down with the breath, what didn't work, and see if the same observations apply now. Sometimes they will, sometimes you begin to realize that what you observed the last time around was a different situation, or you didn't observe it carefully enough. So, you've got to be more observant this time around. But the basic principle is, as long as you're observant now, you can judge these things as to what's working, what's not. As you get clearer and clearer about what you're doing in terms of your thoughts, words, and deeds, it's a lot easier then to see the connections between your actions and their results. When the Buddha gave instructions to his son, he told him, "First thing, before you do or say or think anything, ask yourself what the results are going to be. If it's something you've done before, you can pretty much anticipate the results. If you realized in the past that that kind of action led to harm, don't do it again. If you remember that it led to harm but you go ahead anyhow, that's the kind of mistake you really regret, because it's going to lead to harm again, even though you should have known better." There are essentially two kinds of mistakes. Blameworthy mistakes, the ones where you knew better, but you went ahead and did it anyhow, and mistakes that are blameless, because you didn't know. When you don't know, you try to figure it out and then act on what you think is your best intention, what seems most likely to lead to happiness, and least likely to lead to harm. Now, if you notice that, as you're following through with the action, it does actually lead to harm, you stop. You're not committed to continuing with a mistake. If you don't see any harm coming from the action, carry through with it. When it's done, reflect back on what the actual results were. If you see that it led to any unintended harm, you make the resolve not to repeat that mistake, and talk it over with someone else who is further along on the path, to see what insights they have to offer. If, however, you see that there was no harm at all, take joy in the fact that you're on the path and training yourself well. Then keep up with the training. So, On the one hand, you try to prevent the repeat of past mistakes, but at the same time you realize there is the possibility that you're going to make further mistakes in the future, because there are lots of conditions, lots of situations that you really can't foresee, in which case you try to go with your own skillful intentions as much as you can. This is another reason why we meditate. To strengthen the skillful intentions in the mind, the intentions that are not wound up in greed, aversion, or delusion. Greed and aversion are fairly easy to see. Delusion is hard because after all, when you're deluded, you don't know you're deluded. You don't really know the truth. The only way around that is to keep your past mistakes in mind and to learn from them. So a large part of the practice is learning how to take mistakes in stride. The Buddha says you should feel shame over your mistakes, but not the kind of shame where you feel you're a horrible person. He advises healthy shame. The shame where you realize you did something that was beneath you, that was not appropriate for you. You don't want to repeat that mistake. This kind of shame is a facet of healthy pride. It's not debilitating. The Buddha teaches the same attitude around issues of remorse. You realize you've made mistakes in the past. He doesn't have you dwell on them beyond just recognizing that they were mistakes. You remind yourself that however guilty you may feel about the mistake, the sense of guilt is not going to go back and erase the mistake. The best you can do is to resolve not to repeat it. If you dwell on the guilt, it'll sap your resolve. So, instead, you try to strengthen skillful qualities in the mind, in particular, the attitudes we chanted just now. Unlimited goodwill, unlimited compassion, unlimited empathetic joy, unlimited equanimity. In other words, put yourself in a position where you can maintain these attitudes toward anybody at any time, whenever appropriate. Don't let these attitudes be limited by your likes and dislikes. Basically, you start out with goodwill. Remind yourself that there's no need to see anybody in the world suffer, because when people are suffering, that's when they tend to do evil things. They feel threatened, they feel attacked, they feel they're in a weak position, and so they strike out. So no matter how much you may dislike a particular person, there's really no good reason to wish ill for that person. The wise attitude is to wish that that person find true happiness. If he or she could find true happiness within, the disagreeable behavior that he or she is engaging in would fall away. At the same time, if you can develop goodwill for everybody, it's a lot harder for you to harm people, yourself or anyone else. It strengthens your resolve not to repeat your mistake. The same with compassion. You want to be able to feel it for anyone, regardless. Compassion is what goodwill feels toward people who are suffering, or who are creating the causes for suffering. You don't want to pile more suffering on top of them. If you find yourself in a position where you can help, go ahead. You're happy to help. If you're not in a position to help, you extend that wish may they be relieved from suffering so that maybe someday, if you do find yourself in a position where you can help, you can carry through. As for empathetic joy, that's what goodwill feels for people who are happy or who are creating the causes for happiness. You remind yourself not to be jealous of their happiness. You don't resent their happiness. Try to put yourself in their place. As the Buddha once said, if you see somebody really miserable and suffering, remind yourself, you've been there. If you see a leper on the side of the road, sticking a burning stick into his wounds because they hurt so much, trying to numb the sensation of the itch, remind yourself, you've been there. When you see someone who's really wealthy and powerful, remind yourself, you've been there, too. This should provoke a sense of dismay over the ups and downs of this wandering on. But what it also means is that when you see somebody suffering, remind yourself that you're not necessarily a better person than they are. And you're not immune to that suffering in the future. So you do what you can to help. When someone's happy, remind yourself that you've been there, too. Whatever the happiness may be, it's bound to pass. And the happiness you see in other people is not a sign that they have more good karma than you do. There's no such thing as a single karma account for each person, and what you see is not the running balance in that single account. We all have lots of different actions in the past, And those actions are like seeds that will sprout at different times. Some of them take a long time, some of them take a short time. When you look at your present condition, or anyone else's present condition, you don't see the unsprouted seeds. There's no telling what they'll yield when they sprout. So a person's present happiness is no indicator of what karmic potentials he or she has in store, which means that there's no need to be jealous of anyone else's present happiness. Finally, equanimity is for the situations you really can't help, as when someone is really suffering, and there's really nothing you can do for them. You have to develop equanimity. This is not a hard-hearted equanimity, it's just that you realize you can't let your happiness rise and fall with theirs, because you've got other things you need to do, other areas where you can be of help. You want to focus on those. The trick with all these emotions is learning how to develop them when you need them. All too often our attitude toward our emotions is that they're a given. But, as the Buddha pointed out, you're already shaping your emotions, which means you can change the way you shape them. This is an important skill. That you be able to feel goodwill for anyone at any time when it's called for, that you can feel compassion and empathetic joy any time for anyone when it's called for, that you can develop equanimity even in cases where people are close to you, you want very much to help them, but you can't. You've got to develop equanimity for their suffering. And this requires skill. This is another thing we learn through meditation. As the Buddha once said, our emotions are a fabrication. They're created in the mind. They're not necessarily a given. What are they made out of? Physically, they're affected by the breath. Inside the mind, they are affected by the kind of conversations the mind has with itself, and also by feelings of pleasure and pain, neither pleasure nor pain, and perceptions, the labels we put on things. As we meditate, we're learning how to be more conscious of these factors so that we can turn them in the right direction. If you breathe with more knowledge and alertness, it helps to develop more skillful emotions. Because what is an emotion? It's a thought that gets in your body. It has an impact on your heart rate and other physical processes. Well, the impact comes through the breath. So if you can learn how to get in touch with your breath and can soothe out the breath when it gets erratic or disturbed, then you have a grounding for developing skillful emotions and embodying skillful emotions, so they're not just thoughts. You feel them in your body. As for your perceptions, you learn to look at the world in a way that makes it easier to develop these attitudes. This is also a process that you learn how to master through the meditation as you perceive the breath, say, in the different parts of the body, perceive how it can be spread around, perceive how the breath can be a whole body process, perceive various ways of visualizing the breath. Visualizing the way you relate to the breath. If you learn how to change these things consciously, it gets easier to consciously change other perceptions in day-to-day life as well. That way you can actually turn your emotions in the proper direction. This has an impact on the issue of mistakes in several ways. 1. If you can get more skillful in how you relate to other people, how you relate to yourself, you're less likely to make the particular kinds of mistakes that would obviously do harm. As for mistakes that you can't help simply because you couldn't see what was going to happen in the future, there's a passage where the Buddha said that those kinds of mistakes, if you learn how to develop these unlimited attitudes, don't carry that much karmic impact because your basic attitude doesn't have limits. There are no limits on your goodwill, no limits on your compassion, no limits on your empathetic joy or your equanimity. When your mind is broadened in this way, then the impact of limited past events just doesn't hit it so hard. Even more so as you develop more concentration and discernment. You begin to separate the mind from its objects. In other words, when pain arises, you're aware of the pain, but you don't have to identify with the pain or with the perception that says, "my pain." You can cut right through it and you find that letting it drop makes a huge difference. Or even just the perception of pain. You learn how to question that. You learn to see when a particular perception comes when, for example, there's pain in your legs. How do you visualize that pain? How do you relate to the pain? Where are you in relationship to the pain? Start asking these questions, and you begin to realize how strange some of your perceptions are. Many times you come up with unexpected answers, where you catch yourself portraying the pain in your mind as something with a will of its own. When you stop and think about it, you realize that, of course, it doesn't have a will, it's just there, it's a malfunction of the body. And it doesn't have a shape. The pain also moves around quite a lot, changes a lot more quickly than we tend to assume. You begin to see how your assumptions shape your experience of things. That means you can consciously change your assumptions, change your perceptions, so that you don't have to suffer so much. This gives you the skill to deal with whatever comes. When you have that kind of skill, you can have a lot more confidence, knowing that even if you do make unintended mistakes, you have the skill to deal with the results. In other words, the more mindfulness, the more alertness, the more concentration and discernment you can develop now, the less likely you are to make mistakes. Even when you do make mistakes, you can live with them more easily without being harmed by them. Buddhism is unusual among the world's religions in admitting that it was founded by someone who knew he had made mistakes. The Buddha was a human being just like us. Through many years of his many lives, he knew he had made lots of mistakes, but he learned how to learn from those mistakes. That's what made all the difference. This means that he knew what it's like to make a mistake, to regret making mistakes, to be in the position of living forward, but only understanding backwards. And so from his experience of learning how to overcome those difficulties, he gives us wise advice on not only trying to prevent as many mistakes as you can, but also learning how to live with mistakes, because that's what life is full of. We often make mistakes. If we take them as an opportunity to learn rather than a reason to go into strong guilt or strong denial, we can benefit from them. The more clearly you see and understand what's going on right now, then the less likely it is that the choices you make right now are going to cause harm on into the future. So instead of focusing forward or backward, we learn something from looking back and then focusing back on now as much as possible, because everything comes together right here and now. Everything comes out of right here. So as you go through life, try to bring as much attention as possible to the quality of mind that underlies your decisions right here, right now. Make it as skillful as possible, remembering past mistakes, remembering past right decisions, and learning how to live skillfully with the results of both. January 21, 2010. When we use the phrase, going out into the elements, we're not usually talking about warm breezes of a mild spring day. We're talking about when the wind, water, earth, and fire are showing their extremes, like tonight, with the cold wind and rain, the thunder, the lightning. This is actually a theme of meditation. Thinking about the physical elements, about how huge and awesome they are. The perception of the elements goes together with the perception of wilderness as a way of cleansing the mind of its small everyday concerns, the concerns that otherwise loom so large. These perceptions help you realize how small you are, or at the very least how small your body is. Your little bundle of earth, wind, water, and fire right here. That's one of the reasons the Buddha recommends going out into the wilds, into the elements. It's a way of gaining perspective. For instance, he talks about leaving a village and going out into the wilds. You sit down and you hold in mind the perception that you're out in the wilderness, and it's a very different perception from being in the village with human beings. Whether the village is a small village in Thailand or the global village on your TV, you come out here and those concerns just drop away. You think of yourself being surrounded by nature, surrounded by wilderness. It can be a refreshing perception, but it also carries an edge. Wilderness is big and contains dangers. You realize how small your body is, and how vulnerable, and you feel a sense of awe. That awe is a useful emotion. It's very close to samvega. In fact, one of the meanings of samvega is fear, awe, or terror. It's one of the primary emotions in the practice. Realizing how vulnerable the body is, and as a result, how vulnerable your mind is. This body that you care so much for, that you've looked after since you were able to look after it, all these years. It's such a small thing. The wind we had today could have reached the point of tornadoes, and who knows where the tornadoes might have landed. They could have wiped out the monastery, wiped out other people's homes and businesses. And that's just the wind. The rain can wash whole hillsides away. There have been fires that have come through the immediate area and have burned thousands of acres. When I first saw the fire that forced us to evacuate the monastery 3 years ago, my first thought was, nature's trying to kill us. There have been earthquakes. These things happen all over the world. When we see the results of, say, an earthquake, it's shocking, realizing that we live on an earth that, with a small shrug, can do this to human beings. As soon as you lay claim to the physical elements of a body, you're exposed to the physical elements of the world, regardless of where you are, and those outside elements can crush the body without a moment's thought. When you're out in the wilderness, you're even more conscious of that fact. Years back, I was up in Alaska, camping at the Arctic Circle, and even though it was summer, which meant that it was relatively mild, there was still a very strong sense that for hundreds of miles around, there was just nothing but nature, and more nature, and nature didn't care about you at all. You could die and it would be totally indifferent. That gave rise to a sense of awe. It was a real help in practicing concentration, in getting the mind to settle down. On the one hand, the disturbances of being involved in human society were not there. But on the other, nature seemed so much bigger and implacable. Down here in the lower 48, wilderness is just little islands surrounded by a sea of civilization. Up there, it's the other way around. Civilization is little islands and the wilderness is the sea. It's all around, and very sobering. That kind of sobering thought is very useful in the meditation, for it helps to still the mind. Sariputta recommends a similar reflection. Think about the different physical elements in the body. You realize that these elements are the same elements you see outside when there's a storm, a wildfire, an earthquake, a flood. When those elements outside can change in such radical ways, what about this little body you've got here, composed of the same elements? Is there anything constant? There? Anything you can really lay hold to as yourself or yours? And in response to that question, he says, the body has only a no. It denies your desire for ownership. So it's useful to develop this sense of awe. It helps put things into perspective, that these things we hold on to, the physical body, the affairs of our daily lives, the ups and downs, the concerns about what this person thinks, what that person says, what's going to happen to me, what's going to happen to the people I love, are eventually all going to die. In one way or another, the elements are going to take over. They're going to take everything back. These things we've claimed to be us or ours are going to show that they know nothing of our claims. They have no respect for our claims. That thought focuses you inside. What do you have? You've got just your awareness. You've got the mind. What shape is the mind in? Fortunately, the Buddha doesn't leave us stranded here. All too often in the West, this sense of awe is left simply as an aesthetic sense or a vague religious feeling. But the Buddha gives you further instructions on what to do with it. Take that sense of the earth and think just of the earthness of the earth or the windness of the wind. Don't focus on any of the little details. Make the earthness of earth, and how vast it is, the object of your concentration. Allow your awareness to take on some of that vastness, and then learn how to hold it there. If the elements seem threatening, think of the vastness of space, the space that penetrates all of this activity of the wind and fire and rain. Space penetrates the walls of the meditation hall, the floor, the roof, everything. There's space in all directions, all around us. Learn how to hold that perception. That can form a basis for concentration, and concentration of that sort can put the mind in the right state to reflect on things in their proper perspective. To look at where you cling to things, and what might be in your best interest to let go. If you're looking for your happiness in something that the elements could destroy, don't think you have a special pact with them. They're large and overwhelming and don't give a damn. But you can escape their influence, you can escape their power. That's why we're practicing here. To find something that's not subject to all this wind and rain and the movement of the earth, the potential for fire. This is a very useful contemplation on not self. The undependability of the elements, the stress of trying to find happiness in something that these elements could destroy. Even if it's not yet being destroyed outright, these elements are just wearing away the elements of the body, the faculties of the body, our abilities to see and smell and taste and hear. To think in these ways really helps us to let go of the attachments that are causing us suffering, that weigh the mind down. So here we are in the midst of a storm. But there's something deep inside that doesn't have to suffer from the storm, doesn't have to be threatened by the storm. Even though we may reflect on the awesomeness of the powers of nature and how huge they are, there is something in the mind that's even more enormous, more solid than they are. It can be found through our own efforts, and it offers a security that you can't find in any place because it's outside of places. There's a recurrent phrase in the canon of the arahants being released everywhere, which means released from everywhere, every place. That idea is awesome, too. The reality of it, once you've touched it, is even more awesome than the idea. It's always helpful to keep these thoughts in mind. Conviction and confidence. August 22, 2010. Ajahn Zuwit used to recommend that when you start meditating, try to develop an attitude of confidence and clarity. Those are the meanings of the word, passaddha. Then he'd say to combine that attitude with conviction, or saddha. Conviction that you're doing something really worthwhile. We're not here just going through the motions. We're working on something that's really good. Training the mind. Whether the results come quickly or slowly is not the issue. We're working on something that's noble. There's dignity to what we're doing. We're stepping back from our usual concerns, our usual appetites, and looking carefully at the implications of our actions, realizing that if we're going to act in a way that's responsible, we really have to take responsibility for our minds. And that's what meditation is. Taking responsibility for your mind. So you need the conviction that this is worthwhile and the confidence that it can be done. The word conviction traditionally covers 4 things. The first 3 are conviction that the Buddha really was awakened, conviction that his Dhamma is well taught, and conviction that the Sangha of noble disciples has practiced well. In other words, they have practiced in such a way that they've reached awakening, too. When conviction in these 3 things is confirmed by your first taste of awakening, it issues in a 4th quality, which is that your precepts are clean. In other words, you're firmly established in the 5 precepts. So even though your practice may not have reached the point where your conviction is verified, that you've really seen that these things are true, it's good to cultivate that conviction as much as you can. You cultivate your precepts. You cultivate your conviction in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Those passages we chant every evening, the recollection of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, are actually descriptions of what verified conviction is like. Some of the words may seem strange, but it's useful to reflect on the ones that resonate, the ones that seem relevant to your practice. To begin with, reflect on the fact that the Buddha was awakened through his own efforts. He was able to put an end to greed, aversion, and delusion. That's why he's a worthy one. That right there really merits conviction because it reminds us that it is possible through human effort to put an end to suffering. It is possible through human effort to cleanse the mind. Sometimes you hear the idea that the ego is so corrupt that anything it tries to do is going to be corrupted as well. That idea closes off all the doors except for one. The hope that somebody is going to come along and save you. But that hope is irresponsible. The responsible attitude is that you're responsible for the actions of your mind. You really can choose. And fortunately, your motives are not always corrupt. As the Buddha said, you can take advantage of the fact that you want true happiness and develop some noble qualities out of that. The qualities of purity, compassion, and wisdom come from taking your desire for true happiness seriously. So these things are possible. They're part of the range of possibilities of being human. That right there is a challenge. The Buddha, in effect, is asking you, do you want to live your life keeping this possibility open, or do you want to close it off? Some people actually do want to close it off. They don't like the responsibility that comes with the possibility that true happiness can be found through human effort, that the mind can be cleansed through human effort. It asks a lot. But then, what is life like when those possibilities are closed off? Pretty miserable and confined. I remember when I first went to Singapore. I marveled at how planned everything was. But the sense of marvel was not totally positive. They had everything laid out for you. Where you were going to be born, what you were going to do as a child, where you were going to get your education, where they would channel you when you'd go to work. They had things planned out for your retirement and then for your death. It gives rise to the feeling that you might as well go ahead and die and get it over with, if that was going to circumscribe the totality of your life. But thinking about the possibility that true awakening can be found through your efforts, that breaks through those circumscribed limits. That's not part of anybody else's plan, but that can be part of your plan. And to whatever extent you can nurture that conviction, it keeps your heart nurtured and nourished as well. As for the Dhamma is well taught. The Buddha said things out clearly. I've been reading recently about the romantic attitude toward religious texts, which is that people who write religious texts are those who have gained a sense of oneness, of the deeper parts of themselves in oneness with the world around them, and they just express poetically how wonderful that is. The way they express it, of course, is going to be determined by their cultural background and their personal talents. So the differences in their modes of expression don't really matter. You can interpret their writings as poetically as you like because they were just expressive poetry to begin with. But the Buddha wasn't that sort of teacher. He said that the things he experienced through his awakening were like the leaves in a forest. He didn't waste his time telling us about all the leaves. He gave us the handful of leaves that shows how to gain awakening for ourselves. He wasn't just expressing how wonderful it is to be awakened. He gave us directions for how to do it. And his directions are very precise, very clear. There's a passage where he contrasts his way of teaching with what he calls training in bombast. Training in bombast is where you're taught things that are very poetic, that sound very high, very lovely, very inspiring, but no one is encouraged to ask what, precisely, they mean. After all, in bombast there really is no precise meaning. It's all just vague, high-sounding words. But, as the Buddha said, he taught cross-questioning. Your training with him was in cross-questioning. When there was a teaching you didn't understand, he encouraged you to ask, what's the meaning of this? What's the purpose of that? How far should this word be taken? That way, wherever there are any doubts or uncertainties, you can clear them up. And the Buddha himself was open to cross-questioning. In fact, he took it so seriously that the next to the last thing he said before passing away was to ask the monks, does anyone have any questions, any doubts, any perplexity about the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, the path, or the practice? He made the offer 3 times, and even then after the 3rd time, he said, okay, if you're too embarrassed to speak in public, just inform someone sitting right next to you. That shows how earnest he was, in that he didn't want to leave any doubts or perplexity behind. So when we study the Dhamma, we're not dealing with bombast or vague poetic expressions. We don't have all the uncertainty of trying to figure out, what on earth does this symbolize? Is this an allegory? The Buddha's teachings are like a training manual. They're meant to be put into practice, telling you specific things to do. Now, in some cases he does leave an open question here and there, but it's a question that causes you to grow when you try to figure out the answer on your own. If you're trying to get the mind to settle down, he says, watch the breath as it's long, watch it as it's short. Train yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in and breathe out. Train yourself to calm the sense of fabrication that comes with the breath. The meaning of these instructions isn't obvious, but you can figure out how to do them on your own through experimentation. Trying to figure them out is a good exercise for your discernment. Before teaching breath meditation, he'd encourage you to develop an attitude of patience. He's said to be as non-reactive as the earth. People throw disgusting things on the earth, and the earth doesn't shrink back in horror. It just sits right there. The same with the other great elements. You can use water to wash away dirty things, and the water doesn't complain. Wind blows dirty things around, yet the wind doesn't complain. Fire burns dirty things, yet fire doesn't complain. In other words, you try to develop that quality of solidity and imperturbability so that you can really observe things, to overcome any tendency to push or pull to get quick results, and then getting frustrated and falling back, getting discouraged. Wanting things to be a certain way and getting frustrated when they aren't. If you're going to learn from your meditation, you've got to develop an attitude of patience and solidity that allows you to sit with things, however they are, and really see them for what they are. Pose the question in your mind and just watch, try different approaches, because the Buddha didn't stop his meditation instructions with equanimity and patience. He went on to teach the 16 steps of breath meditation, most of which involve training, experimenting, and using your ingenuity. There's an intentional element to this practice. You're trying to figure out a skill, sensitize yourself to a certain area of your experience, either the body or your feelings or the state of your mind. Notice where there's stress and then figure out how you can calm that stress. In other words, these are things you do. You don't just sit there. You don't give up trying to improve things. If things aren't working, you develop a confident attitude. There's got to be a way out of here, but you simply haven't figured it out yet. The problem lies in something you're doing. Maybe you're pushing in the wrong direction or up against something in the wrong way, but you can change that if you step back and watch for a while. The Buddha has it all very clearly laid out, so that we don't have to keep starting from scratch every time we practice. You just learn how to apply general principles to your specific case. In this way, there's a creative element in the practice. But you can rest confident that things were laid out clearly. Whatever's there in the Dhamma is meant for you to use as part of the path to awakening. When you find awakening, you don't have to have anybody describe it for you or tell you how wonderful it is. You know what it's like for yourself. As for conviction in the Sangha, that they've practiced well, that's useful for when comparing yourself to the Buddha seems a little bit unreal. You look at the members of the noble Sangha. Men, women, young, old, educated, uneducated, rich, poor. Some people practiced quickly, got quick results, other people took a long time, but they finally got the desired results. Sometimes it's most inspiring to read about the ones who were having the most difficulty, because you look at their difficulties and say, well, mine are nothing compared to theirs. Yet in the midst of their discouragement, they could find something worthwhile. And they had a conviction that carried them through, even when things looked pretty bleak. Their conviction was what enabled them to find a way out. It's like being lost in the woods. If you think there's no way out, you're not going to find a way out. But if you're convinced that there must be a way out, you keep looking and looking and looking. And regardless of how long it takes, the conviction that there's a way out is a necessary part of finding the escape. The fourth element of conviction is learning to keep your precepts pure. It may seem strange to list this as a kind of conviction, but for the Buddha, conviction isn't just conviction in ideas, it's something you actually put into practice. It has to find its way into your actions. If you really do want to develop compassion, wisdom, and purity, you've first got to look at your actions. What are you doing? What's the impact of your actions? How scrupulous are you about doing things the right way, the harmless way? The more you find that you can stick with your precepts, the more confidence you gain in yourself. At the same time, you're developing the essential qualities of mind you need for the meditation. Mindfulness, alertness, being observant, so that your actions are not at odds with your principles. When progress in your meditation seems slow, you remind yourself, at least I'm not harming anyone. That's something to treasure. When you look at the way the world is, everybody seems to be shoving everybody else out of the way, to get what? Something that's going to slip right through their fingers. All they have left is the memory of the horrible things they did, which is no treasure at all. But here we're developing treasures. We've got the treasure of conviction, the treasure of virtue, the treasure of a sense of shame, i.e., your sense of your own self-worth, that you would be ashamed to stoop to harmful actions. The treasure of compunction. That when you think of doing something harmful, you just pull back and say, "No, I can't do that for fear of the harm." You've got 4 of the 7 noble treasures right there. When you bring this attitude to the practice, you're starting with a good foundation. You're ready to learn from the meditation regardless of how well or how poorly it may go. You're not so neurotic or brittle that you have to pretend that there is no such thing as poor meditation. Sometimes the meditation just doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work. Recognize that it's not going well and pose some questions in your mind. Exactly what's going wrong? Tease things out. Is there something wrong with the breath, something wrong with the body? Is it the state of mind you're bringing? The beliefs you're bringing? Something that happened today and got you all stirred up? Learn how to separate these things out, so that regardless of how well or poorly the meditation goes, you know how to learn from it, to learn how to benefit from it. The lessons you learn, the benefits you get, may not be the ones you planned, but you've got to learn how to appreciate them, so that your sense of conviction stays strong and gets more and more reliable. You learn to appreciate the results that you do get, regardless of whether they're what you wanted in terms of the bliss, the rapture, whatever. There are a lot of other important things to learn from meditation, you know. And when you learn how to recognize them, they're all good. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.